Welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We have a return guest today, Dr. Jason Kindrachuk, the Canada Research Chair at the University of Manitoba, an infectious disease expert, molecular pathogenesis of emerging and re-emerging viruses. Right? Have I got that?
That is perfect.
Welcome back, Jason. It's just time, we thought, for kind of an overview. Where are we at? We're talking about vaccine passports, whether people who are vaccinated still need to wear masks, new variants, the whole nine yards. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great. Now, you also did some work in Saskatchewan for the last year at VIDO, where the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, where they're developing vaccines against COVID. What's the latest there as you've left? Are that I think they were going into a testing stage?
Yeah. So they've gone through their phase 1 trial. They're looking for recruiting for phase 2. So the vaccine certainly is moving ahead. When it will ever get licensed, I think is a bigger question. But certainly, I think it shows the power of Canadian science and being able to develop Canadian vaccines and also be responsive to public health crises.
This is a question that keeps emerging, that right now my understanding is that all of the vaccines that are out there that appear to be working really, really well only yet have emergency use status. Nothing has been approved and said, okay, this is going to work. It's going to be fine. Why are we still in that gray zone?
I think part of it is because we're still in a public health emergency, and that's really the reason why. A lot of this is trying to get vaccines out to people once there actually, has been some, causal proof of effectiveness and efficacy. Getting those rolled out to populations as quickly as possible without getting mired in trying to get through licensure first. So right now, it is just getting vaccines out to the communities, and I think they're looking at trying to get licensure done when we're at a period in time when we have good protection from the virus and we're not looking at overwhelming hospitals and certainly overwhelming numbers of cases.
And has this got anything to do with, and in your world you would understand this, legal liability? As long as these vaccines are sort of just approved for emergency use only, then if there are negative side effects, nobody's actually accountable or can't be sued.
I mean, that's certainly beyond my level of expertise. I mean, the one thing I can say is that, listen, the idea of looking at these long-term effects of vaccines, that's going to be a rolling process for years, right? So when we move out and get things, once they're even licensed, there still is that post-licensure period where adverse events continue to be reported and continue to be monitored. So I think we have to appreciate that over time, these things will be looked at. And certainly, again, when we go back to looking at vaccines as a whole, really adverse events are always seen within those first few months following vaccination. So that again gets back to this idea that in terms of long-term effects, it's not saying that they could never happen, but certainly history would at least suggest that the period of time beyond a few months post-vaccination, we should be in a pretty comfortable period of certainty.
How are we collecting data on this? Now, there's, I don't know what percentage exactly of the population, not quite half in Canada, that's been double vaccinated. How are they collecting research? If I'm sitting here, I've got 2 vaccines in my arm. So if I'm experiencing some kind of side effects, how's that information captured?
Yeah, so a lot of it. So certainly, places like the United States have basically an open system, the VAERS system, that allows you to basically go in, create a profile, and report an adverse event. So what we have to keep in mind is that there is the ability to utilize the system to say that any sort of correlative activity could be related back to vaccine status, right? So if you broke an arm or if you took a fall, we've seen different types of events that have been reported that aren't linked back causally to vaccines. So those events are always reported. And certainly when you go back to your physician and you report that you've had some sort of an event, the physician also can report that system back to the health regulators for these products. So that information does continue to get collected and collated over time.
But as my understanding in Canada, it's just kind of voluntary. I mean, nobody's asking me. Nobody said to me when I got my second shot, look, over the next couple of months, would you please fill out this form and send it to us so we know whether these things are working?
It's a great point, right? So all of this is done in a voluntary basis. I think for people to feel like they aren't, I don't want to say rely, but there is a regulation forcing them to have to report back. And I think, again, you have to kind of come to this comfortability of trying to get people to feel comfortable using the system. So using this in a voluntary basis, but also trying to get strong uptake from the community to do this. And where that kind of fine line lies with getting enough data back to give appreciable data that can be used to say whether or not there have been any adverse events recorded, that's a bigger question.
Because it seems like we've got all these, test populations everywhere, whether it's the US or Canada or Israel or
Mhm.
the UK. I mean, it seems like there should be a wealth of knowledge that it would be helpful for people like you to have access to. It would
Well, and that's
seem.
what I Well, and that's the great thing about the public open or the open data set access, right? Is that you can
Okay.
go in, you can go in and get those reports from across the globe. And I think that's the most important part is we have to consider the fact that, listen, what we see in different regions of the world may not be the same as what we see in Canada, because we have those regional differences and certainly differences in the reporting systems. So you can go in and be able to look across different communities and different populations and say, are we seeing similarities in events? Or are we seeing any uptick in events that are being reported across different areas of the world?
That's always a puzzling question to me because we've seen this in our own country. The numbers in Ontario go up, or the numbers in
Mhm.
Manitoba go up, and the numbers in Saskatchewan go down. There are no walls, there are no
Yeah.
formal borders. We're all the same people. Why does that happen?
Yeah, I think this gets back to a lot of the, kind of, social science aspects of
Yeah.
trying to understand behavioral differences from population to population. Certainly, I just got back from Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan, at the point that we left, had the highest uptake of vaccination in the country. Now we get to Manitoba, and Manitoba now is leading the country in vaccinations. When in the past we were predominantly in the lower tier of vaccine uptake. So I think a lot of it, certainly you can go back to that idea of hesitancy, but you can also look at what is going on in the population. Manitoba has had that uptick of cases. We had a very rough third wave. I think people have gotten genuinely or generally concerned about what may happen with the Delta variant or other variants that get back into the population. So you start to see that people maybe are a little bit more forthright in saying, I'm going to go get vaccinated. Now there's broader accessibility for me in the community, and I feel more inclined to be protected. And maybe in Saskatchewan, because they've been able to kind of keep cases at least at a fairly kind of plateaued rate, and certainly with hospitalizations keep a plateaued rate, you don't have that same, I think maybe air of caution in a lot of people in saying, oh, this is a clear and present danger right now. So maybe you don't have that same uptick at the same moment in time.
You've raised an interesting question that's kind of in the back of my mind about when we start changing the messaging. Okay,
Yeah.
first it was, you've got to do this. You're essentially you're going to die, or you're at risk of death
Yeah.
if you don't do this. And then we went the full range to, win $1 million if you go and get vaccinated. We've got people really resisting when we're told with a double vaccination, you still need to wear your
Yeah.
mask. Where are we right now? What do we need to be saying to people about how to deal with this situation?
It's a great question, right? And I think this goes back to starting to look at the communities where we're seeing really no uptake of vaccines and trying to figure out historically, have we seen this in those communities and what are the underlying reasonings behind that? And to be fair, in some of these communities, certainly here in Manitoba, in certainly the southeast region of the province, we have historical precedents for that goes on century or beyond in terms of persecution that may have taken place and in other communities. That has all come back to this idea of why there may be a lack of trust within government mandates or government recommendations for healthcare. So I think that what we have to do now is kind of appreciate that, listen, we've been able to get out to the majority of people that have wanted to get vaccinated, even those that were hesitant. I think we've done a good job in getting a lot of those people into vaccine super sites and getting them vaccinated. Now we have to concentrate on those areas where it's going to take more time, and certainly I think a far greater understanding of the community to build up trust to get to get vaccinations done. And that's not going to happen overnight. There's not going to be, I think, some miracle of money or products that you can provide those communities that's going to change that decision process overnight. But we have to invest, because it's not just about COVID, it's about beyond COVID. How do we get vaccinations increased within those communities for things like influenza and beyond that continue to present a clear and present danger for us every year?
So you got in this country, by and large, the people who were willing and enthusiastic. You've even got a lot of the hesitant signing up and agreeing to go. But then there are these groups, pockets, as you say, across the country for different reasons. So my view of that is, okay, you've got to build that trust and target them in a positive way. But we're also at the time of saying, okay, well, if you've got a vaccination, you can do this and you'll be rewarded. Yeah. And if you don't, you're going to be punished, and we're not going to let you go to the movies or the concert.
Yeah, and that brings into play some serious ethical questions, right? And certainly, again, I am just a simple virologist, but when we get back to this idea of looking at this, of vaccine equity amongst populations, one of the concerns that there always has been with passports, this idea of vaccine passports, has been if you can't make vaccines equitable in your communities, you may have certain communities, whether it's lower socioeconomic status or particular demographics of your population, that may be ostracized based on that, even subconsciously being ostracized because maybe they weren't able to get to the vaccine clinics, or maybe they weren't made accessible to those communities. So we have to be very cautious in how we portray that message of saying, if you have your dual vaccinations, you can do X, Y, and Z, because we want to ensure that those communities that haven't had access do get access and do get the same benefits. So it's very, very difficult to navigate that territory. And thankfully, there's people far smarter than me that are trying to do this.
Yeah, the privacy experts are wrangling this as we speak. But I'm kind of half joking, but not. I mean, you're a Saskatchewan boy, moved to Manitoba, and here we've got the case where you can't go to a Winnipeg Blue Bombers game unless you can prove you've been vaccinated. But you can go to a Rough Riders game. So when those two meet, what are we? I mean, these are very practical questions. I'm not even being flip. This is our real world.
No, it is, right, and certainly, for me, I work in a lot of international areas. So things like, my yellow card for my vaccine status for yellow fever, I'm used to carrying that and used to the fact that I could be denied access to certain countries if I don't have it. And that's part and parcel of protection of those communities. For us, this is very novel, right? This is not something we're used to as Canadians. And certainly, again, we have to get back to this idea of saying, if we're seeing communities that do not have vaccinations, what is the historical precedence for that? And are there underlying socioeconomic or sociodemographic reasonings and social determinants for why those communities have not get vaccinated? How do we meet those to ensure that those people can get access?
The recent stats on the uptake of the federal government's app, which said, it was supposed to tell you if you'd been in contact, it was so low. People wouldn't take it up and wouldn't use it. And I think it is a nervousness about government having data. We're seeing when the government puts out legislation saying they want to monitor what we're doing online, people really react to that. So the vaccine, I mean, as you say, you're an international traveler, you're used to having that there and showing it. But this is going to be beyond building trust. This is a whole other willingness on the part of the public to share their most personal information with big tech, big government, whoever it is, neither of whom they trust.
Absolutely. And one of the things that comes into play again with this is this idea of transparency, right? So I certainly, I'm somebody that worked in the United States for 7.5 years. And, there were massive issues. Certainly, I lived down there during the NSA crisis. So there were all these questions about transparency and illegal, documenting of data and personal data. So people have kept that in mind and have that historical precedence to be concerned. We have to be very cautious as we move forward, and ensuring that each step of the way that we're ensuring with the public that there is that open transparency to say, this is the data that's collected, this is what's accessible, and here's what will happen if there is any sort of data breach. Again, looking at doing this from the pivotal point of the people that are putting all these systems into place and being able to say, this is the limitations on being able to access your data. This is why it's safe, and this is why we should be doing it. So it should be a constant conversation with Canadians, as opposed to just having something implemented that all of a sudden we have to do to be able to do the things that we've normally done as part of our society for years.
And that's going to fall on employers too, and university presidents and whoever is going to require this to be. What do we do about that gray area? And I know I'm asking you to talk about sort of policy matters, but from your vantage point on this, what do we do about the people who naturally had COVID and are therefore immune and therefore cannot show that they've had 2 vaccinations?
Yeah, so this gets into such a big area, right? And this was one of the questions that certainly came out very early on in 2021 was, what do we do with this population that has had validated, confirmed prior infection? And what do we understand about their immunity? Well, certainly we've seen, I think, some movement towards suggestions of even single dose vaccinations for those people to ensure that they are getting basically a boost that would be equivalent to what we would see with people that had 2 doses of vaccines. What we have to keep in mind is that when we look at natural infections, we're looking at a breadth of disease, right? So we're looking at people that have asymptomatic infection all the way to severe infection and everything in between. So you have immune responses that are up and down all over the place. Now, if you go in and you boost those people, at least the data that's been suggested so far is that even with a single dose of vaccine, now what happens is you remove some of that noise, and now you get a nice consistent amount of immune response across those individuals. So what you can say is that regardless of background infection, we at least have confidence that people that have this dosage of vaccine with prior infection are going to have a normalized immune response that's equivalent to other people that did not have infection and got the 2 doses of vaccine. Whether or not that will occur quickly, I think is still a question, because we have to get enough data to have confidence in that. But certainly we're seeing some movement and discussion towards that. But I think for now, you're going to see people that are still going to be required to have those 2 doses of vaccine, so we know that their immune response is consistent.
So in a sense, you're telling us we have to trust the medicine more than the body's natural response.
Yeah, and to be fair, I do, because of the fact that the vaccines are meant to basically activate our immune system in a very specific way. So we think about this idea of natural infection. One of the things we have to consider is that natural infection doesn't necessarily give us sterilizing immunity, or doesn't just give us lifelong immunity. It likely gives us some amount of immune response and some amount of antibody response that's sustained over time, but it doesn't necessarily equate to a very robust response. So we have to be very cautious in that. And I think that's where we look at vaccines are being registered based on overall antibody responses, T cell responses, all of those immune correlates of protection that we need to see. So that gives us a better indication of whether somebody is going to be truly protected from subsequent infection and or protected from severe disease.
I want to talk a little bit about these variants, because it was interesting to hear, I mean, others have said it, but the British Prime Minister this week again saying, look, we're going to be living with this. It's not like COVID is going to be over and then we're going to get on with life. COVID is now present. COVID is now a fact of life.
Yeah.
But every other day, I mean, we've been through, well, they're all named differently. And then we've gone to Alpha, Beta, and Delta. And now we've got Lambda out of Peru. And it's in 29 countries already.
Yeah.
So again, that's the question. A, what is it? We can't stop travel in the whole world. It got to 29 countries, amazingly. So what do we, is this an ongoing response?
The easy answer is yes. And certainly I know that's exhausting. It's certainly exhausting for me to have to say it. Where we sit right now is that while we look at good vaccine coverage in North America, certainly in Canada and the US, good vaccine coverage starting to take place in different areas of Europe and even into the Middle East, what we have to be considerate of is that there still is a very large portion of the population globally that has not seen any vaccination yet. And that's where our concerns lie in regards to variants of concern. Because to be fair, when we start looking at communities that have no vaccination coverage whatsoever, if you have a particular variant of concern that is more transmissible, now what you're looking at is the fact that those variants could take hold of those populations extremely quickly, much faster than we've seen previously. And that's where I think our true concern lies, is that, listen, the vaccines have been, I think, just unbelievably historic discoveries for COVID-19, in the sense that every variant that's been thrown at the vaccine, certainly the mRNA vaccine so far, we've seen continued protection against. That may change a little bit over time. We may see a little bit of fluctuation there, but ultimately we're seeing good protection against severe disease. So that should give us some confidence. What we need to be focusing on is this idea that, how do we get vaccines out to those areas of the world where we aren't actually seeing any vaccination coverage? Because to be fair, if we want to get through this idea of COVID, and we want to get rid of this idea of continued emergence of variants of concern, the more people we get vaccinated, the better we're going to do globally.
When we what do you know about Lambda? Like, where did that come from?
It's a great question, right? So everything we know about Lambda has really, been fit into the last 7 months. So looks like it first emerged in Peru in December 2020. It certainly has been circulating in Peru. We've seen now that it's moved out to different countries, though I think the question that remains is, does that equate to greater transmissibility in those additional countries, or are we just seeing introduction, but no subsequent, fitness advantage where it's starting to transmit wider and wider and wider? What we have seen so far is that there certainly are mutations within Lambda that should give us a little bit of pause and say, okay, there are some flags within this particular variant of concern, or variant of interest, I should say, that we need to monitor to see whether or not this does lead to enhanced transmissibility in communities, and whether we see any change in disease severity or vaccine coverage. But we haven't seen that so far. And I think that's what's important, is that the data that's been accrued so far, looking at neutralizing antibodies, looking at the ability of vaccines to protect, so far the vaccines continue to hold against Lambda. So yes, it's on the radar. We certainly have to be monitoring it. But I think we have to also take a step back and say, listen, the vaccines have worked very well. The more people we get vaccinated, the smaller the pocket of people that potentially can get infected or likely transmit widely these variants that are showing up. And if we continue to shrink down that population, the lower percentage of a chance there is, or risk there is, of these variants of interest and concern becoming present in our own communities.
We talked about this a little bit the last time when you were on, but so we all remember SARS from 2003, and now COVID, 2019, 2020, 2021. What have we actually learned about that? This is your world.
Yeah.
What do we know now that we did not know in 2003?
I think the biggest thing for us that we need to identify is that coronaviruses certainly are a pandemic threat, right? So coming out of 2003, out of SARS, and moving through 2009 flu and beyond, coronaviruses were, kind of heralded as being this, potential pandemic threat. But I think a lot of people maybe didn't take that completely seriously. We were very focused on influenza because that is something that has continued to present as a pandemic. COVID hit us very, very hard. And I think it showed us ultimately how susceptible we are to a virus that is able to transmit widely within our communities, which is not what we saw with SARS in the past. It was transmitted primarily in healthcare settings. So for us, what do we understand, or what do we need to understand? The biggest thing right now is, what is the origin of this virus? We can get back into this debate about whether this was, a lab leak or a gain of function study, or whether it was natural origin, but we have to have, I think, some clarity on where this virus is circulating in nature, because ultimately it did come out of somewhere. Whether you look at lab leaks or gain of function experiments or natural origin, it was somewhere within wildlife originally before it was identified. And that to me is the biggest question, because we have to think about this idea that in our world today, we are in constantly increasing I guess, contact with wildlife. Certainly with bats in many areas of the world, which are unfortunately animals that carry a wide variety of viruses. So we have to start to figure out, okay, what are the communities that are the most likely to see spillovers of these viruses, and how do we start to try to decrease the risk of those spillover events from occurring? And that's not easy. This is not going to be something that we're going to be able to take care of overnight, but we have to be very cautious that this has happened once before. It is going to happen again because it has historically happened over and over and over again. And these events are happening with increasing frequency.
So the crossover from species to species. So you're saying it was there somewhere,
Yeah.
obviously, in the natural world. But then when it starts to be studied and looked at in labs, and the evidence is, I guess, increasing bit by bit that something happened at the lab in Wuhan, but they were still working with a naturally occurring virus in the first place, and then seeing what they could or should or shouldn't be doing with it. I won't talk about weaponizing it. That's a separate
Yeah.
issue. But to just study this stuff, there's always the risk. You go into a lab, if you're not properly dressed and you're susceptible to things you're working with.
Certainly
So
there is. And listen, in my area of the world, I've worked in high containment labs for over a decade now, whether it was BSL-3 or BSL-4. These areas are, I feel extremely safe in working in those labs, but I feel safe because I'm extremely cautious and certainly very risk adverse, which is, I think, is what you want to have in people that are working in these labs. And certainly the oversight and the screening process requires that you have people that are going in that are trained very well for this. So I think what we have to think about is, certainly there was this idea of, okay, what would happen if you had a breach of personal protective equipment and somebody got infected in the lab and that got out? Those things certainly, we always need to be cautious about. We always need to be looking at mechanisms to be able to increase that protection. To me, the biggest question is, if we have people that are living or in kind of moving into areas where we have bat roosts or we have other wildlife that we know carry many of these viruses, how do we decrease that direct contact? Because certainly in many areas of the world, we're not talking about just people that are bitten by a bat. We're talking about them being exposed to saliva or urine or feces or dead animals. How do we decrease those contacts from occurring, or at least make people more protected when they're undergoing through those activities? And it's not easy. Certainly in my travels through West Africa and beyond, this is not something where it's as easy as just saying, okay, we'll just get gloves out to these people. That would help. But also we have to start thinking about cultural
aspect to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we can't really fundamentally solve this problem till we know what created the problem. we do have to get back to that origin issue.
Absolutely. And the thing that we have to appreciate is that this is not something that within the next 90 days or the next 6 months, right, we're going to have an answer for. And that to me is one of the things we have to be prepared for, is that the question of where did it come from? It could be, maybe we will have some miracle and in 6 months' time, we find a bat that's infected. But this could be decades long. Certainly for Ebola, we're still looking for that bat that has infectious virus. All the data tells us that this is where it came from, but it isn't as easy as just going and trapping bats and identifying it. So that part we have to be very prepared for, and continuing to build up information and trying to change practices across the board that are going to decrease the risk of spillovers from occurring.
I'm not optimistic that the Chinese are going to be completely transparent about this. And that's going to affect the research for people like you and millions like you around the world.
It is. Transparency is something that is certainly is built up over years and can disappear within the span of a few hours, right? So we have to be very wary of that, and certainly we have to be very cautious of how we work through the politics of this. That from a science standpoint, listen, I think scientists collaborate very openly, and often we do this from a very apolitical fashion. We need to figure out a way to build that bridge again, certainly with China and beyond, with these communities, to be able to try and figure out that answer. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. We need very smart people that can navigate this.
So we're in, as you say, the kind of the infancy of our understanding about where it all came from and how it started. but we seem to have gone a lot further on the vaccine
Yeah.
front. How is that possible?
The possibility for all this comes back to the fact that we've been working on vaccines with, I think, unbelievable speed over the past few decades. So when we look at the advancement of vaccines, so looking at, say, 1980, when we announced the eradication of smallpox, to where we sit now in regards to the types of vaccines that are available and how many different platforms we have to use. That's why there's been such, I think, a fast-paced ability and an expedited ability for us to develop these vaccines, is that the platforms weren't developed overnight. They'd been going through years upon years of making and testing and optimizing.
mRNA
So
based.
absolutely, absolutely, right? So what really changed was our ability to sequence viruses, so sequence the entire genome of viruses within the span of a few days. So having access to those genomes within a few weeks, whereas during 2009 it took months of time to have that changed the dynamic completely, because you could have people that were creating vaccines within the span of a few weeks of identification of the actual virus itself.
Are we making the same progress on treatments?
Yeah, so this is much more complicated. I think we're making progress. The difficulty is that when we think about treatment, so vaccines, you give somebody a vaccine, they develop an immune response, and they hopefully will not be able to get infected, although that's obviously a question, but hopefully they'll have protection from severe disease. When we think about treatments, now you have to think about what your treatment is targeting. Is it targeting the virus itself, or is it targeting your actual immune response? Because those two things are very different. And depending on when you apply that therapeutic, you're going to have very different activities. And that's where the nuance of all this becomes much, much greater. And I think the difficulty in trying to identify a therapeutic that works within that defined window is extremely difficult. So I think we're making progress, but certainly trying to find something that actually gives clinical benefit to patients is a much greater task.
Because, as we have been discussing, these variants keep appearing. So we need to keep treating people who get sick before a vaccine is going to work or before they have been vaccinated.
Well, and I think there's this idea that once we have the vaccines, that okay, that's it. We don't need a therapeutic. We're fine. Well, no, because again, we go back to this idea that supportive care in this area of the world, and certainly in resource plentiful settings, supportive care systems can still get overwhelmed, but we have good supportive care. When we look at those areas of the world right now that are being hit very hard by this virus, these are areas that don't have a lot of capacity for mechanical ventilation. So those are the areas that we certainly need to have therapeutics. They will be stretched thin very, very quickly.
I just want to end on just a question about what's going on in your head. There's all the energy that comes from, we have a new scientific challenge here and we're going to build vaccines, and there's the technical substantive side of your work. You're also a human being with young children and all of that sort of thing. Where are you sitting on this? Are you going to go to a football game? Are you going to get on a plane? How do you think about it?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm looking forward to the most is getting back to Africa, right? So when I look at this idea of where we are in COVID-19, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that COVID-19 didn't just stop the spread of all other infectious diseases, that COVID-19 is happening on top of everything else we have. So to me, that's where my headspace is that we've got to get through this public health crisis. But we still have a number of public health crises that are going on in the background. And we have to somehow be able to get back to a point of being able to provide care and research focus and clinical trials that are devoted to those additional infectious diseases. So I'm hopeful that we're kind of moving towards a latter trajectory of COVID-19. But certainly it doesn't mean that the work is over. Basically, it just means that attention will get focused back on things like Ebola and influenza and all the other infectious diseases that we continue to face.
Okay, here's the really tough question. When you've got your second vaccine, do you still have to wear your mask?
Yeah, I was concerned you're going to ask me about this. Oh, so there's no easy answer, right? And so the easiest way I can say this is when we look at transmission between people that are vaccinated, so the people that have gotten both vaccine doses, the likelihood and the risk of transmission is exceedingly low. So if you have a community of people that have both vaccines, are fully immunized, the likelihood is no, there's going to be no transmission, and the masks are not going to provide any additional benefit because transmission is already low. Then you start working backwards and you say, okay, what about people that are partially vaccinated? Well, again, the risk is still reduced in regards to infection, but it's not going to be reduced as much as you would see with 2 doses. So now that risk scale starts to increase a little bit. So yeah, maybe in some of those cases, you want to have people that are still masked. If you're dealing with people where you have a high number of unvaccinated people in a population and a very low population of people that are fully vaccinated, masks are likely still going to be required. So to me, the question that comes back to for all this is, where are we sitting in regards to test positivity rates, cases, and hospitalizations in our communities? Those should be really the driving influences on many of these restrictions.
And everybody needs to just do their homework and find that out.
Yeah, across all levels, right? So from the public health communities through to us as individuals.
So good to talk to you again. And I'm going to say this on behalf of everybody, not only from Saskatchewan, everybody, you make us proud for the work that you're doing. And I just want to profoundly thank you for the work that you're doing. So keep at it.
I appreciate that. Certainly very humbly accept that. But no, listen, this work all falls onto the shoulders of so many people across Canada and across the globe. So I'm but a very small cog in the wheel of people that are responding to this. But thank you.
Well, we appreciate our conversations with this cog. So thanks.
Thank
we'll
you.
Talk to you again soon. Dr. Jason Kindrachuk, the Canada Research Chair at the University of Manitoba, an infectious disease expert and a guy who's actually working on not only vaccines to counter COVID, but he's dealing with infectious diseases around the world, that more global perspective. Thanks again. All the best.
Thank you.
That's it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you again next time.